I have this view about the economies essentially divided up into what's referred to as the primary sector, which is the resource extractive sector, which is agriculture, mining and so forth. Then there's what's referred to as the secondary sector, which is manufacturing. And then there's the tertiary sector, which is services. And you hear a lot of people talk about how as economies develop and so forth, they move towards services, and the movement towards services and away from agriculture and manufacturing is a sign of economic maturity. I actually think it's a sign of economic stupidity. I think you need to have strength in all three sectors. For example, a country like Japan, if the rest of the world stopped exporting natural resources to Japan, it would be in all sorts of trouble. It doesn't have many of its own. And so whilst Japan has a strong secondary and tertiary sectors, it has a weak primary sector. So it's vulnerable in that sense. If you take a country like Greece, well, it hasn't got anything other than a fairly weak tertiary sector. It doesn't have a strong primary sector, and that's weakish. It's used to have a reasonably strong secondary sector, but it's just deindustrialised itself like many European countries over the last 30, 40 years. So I think it's important that you have strength in all three sectors. You need to have a fairly strong resource base, because you need resources to produce goods and services. And if you're reliant upon importing them from the rest of the world, that renders you very vulnerable. You need a strong manufacturing sector, because the goods that are produced by the manufacturing sector are in fact inputs to the services sector. I don't know about you, but I've never had my hair cut by an imaginary hairdresser, an imaginary salon. I mean, but using imaginary scissors and an imaginary comb. I mean, all these things that are required to run at the services or tertiary sector are goods that are being produced and generated by the manufacturing or secondary sector. So I think it's important to have strength in all three. I think Australia's got strength, obviously, in the primary and the tertiary, but has got weakness in the secondary. But the fact it's had so much strength in the primary sector, particularly in terms of exporting resources, is one of the reasons why Australia avoided the global financial crisis. The other thing, as Steve said, was the deficit spending of the Labor government at the time. But not all countries had the luxury of having so many resources to be able to export natural resources, to export to the rest of the world to help reduce the full impact of the global financial crisis. So Australia was fortunate in that respect. And I think Canada was probably much the same as well. I don't think Canada was that adversely affected by the global financial crisis. And I think it was similar to Australia. It's a very strong resource-based economy, and so it was able to export natural resources to countries like China and India, which helped to moderate the impact of the global financial crisis. But ultimately, Australia is now in a situation where resource prices aren't what they were around that time, immediately after the global financial crisis. So it's not, so exporting natural resources is not supporting the economy to the same extent that it was. And the fact that we lack a strong manufacturing sector is one of the reasons why the Australian economy is sort of in limbo at the moment. It's not in recession, but it's not booming either.